Welcome, everybody, to the Advanced Task Mode webinar. Our instructor today will be Dan Rainier. Dan is online and ready to go, so let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. The first thing I'd like to point out to everybody's attention here is this particular webinar I created actually for a live audience back at a global Microsoft project conference not too long after the concept of manually scheduled mode was added to the project. And I used all slides in a live presentation where we were all face-to-face, and it went over pretty well. I'm going to do that again here today, and I'm using most of that same material from that time. I think the word advanced is somewhat appropriate for today because this presentation does kind of require in some ways that you kind of already really know project in some way and you know auto schedule. So we'll just give it our best shot here today, and if there's questions, Bob will be monitoring those, and we'll have time at the end, hopefully, to answer some questions. And if not, all of you that are joining right now, and I see a lot of familiar names, you can certainly reach out to me afterwards, send me a note, give me a call, whatever, to get some further clarification. So here we go. Let's give this a try. All right. So I think we're ready to go. That looks like a lot of horses that are ready to go out of the gate. I think that's how we are right now, ready to go. Again, thank you in many different languages on behalf of Milestone Consulting Group. For those of you that don't know us, we are a gold project and portfolio management partner and have been for some time. We are a complete Microsoft project and portfolio management services providing organization. We have been a member of the Product Advisory Council for Microsoft Project for probably over 8 years now. I think I need to change that bullet point, which means we've had a lot of input on the product over time, and it actually extends much farther back than the Project Advisory Council. We are a PMI registered education provider. At the end of today's webinar, I'll provide you with the PDU information that you need for today's webinar. Okay. Again, I'm Dan Rainier, partner at Milestone Consulting Group, based out of Bloomington, Minnesota, the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I encourage you to reach out to me via email or connect with me via LinkedIn. I enjoy seeing people's posts on LinkedIn. Spend a little bit of time out there every day reading some posts that people put out. Good information, but feel free to connect. I am the creator of Milestone's YJTJ process for Microsoft Project. I've done a fair amount of guest speaking over the years in a number of venues and have done some writing over time as well. Most importantly for you today, I've got over 25 years of Microsoft project experience, day in and day out. So I hope our collective years of experience and my personal years of experience shine through for you here today. You heard Bob Tyler here a moment ago. He's our principal consultant, lead education guy, runs our education group. Bob is another very, very talented Microsoft project server, PWA guy, and a project management guy. Not too long ago, Bob put on a presentation called Microsoft Project in Agile that was very well attended. If you ever have any questions about that or would maybe like to see that, let Bob know. If you have any issues today with technology, Bob is manning the controls. Please send Bob an email or reach out to him through the chat window, and Bob will take care of any of your technical issues while I'm moving along here through this seminar. Okay, today's webinar is designed to provide you with valuable insight into Microsoft Project. To achieve maximum value, we always recommend our hands-on role-based training. Our hands-on training is highly interactive and can be delivered in a number of formats. Later today, I will give you an idea of some of the offerings that we have very briefly. And our webinars tend to be more one way from the presenter, but if you just really pay close attention today and save some good questions for the end, I'm quite sure you'll get some good information out of today's seminar. Okay, I'm going to run all this, as I said, in PowerPoint, in part because this is how I built this one years ago. But again, there's always the likelihood of internet latency issues if I go into the live products. But I do have project ready to go. I always do if needed. And usually I'll bring that up in the question and answer session. If somebody has a question, I'll usually go back to project and try and answer the question verbally and on screen. All right. So let's go ahead and get started and get out of the gates. We have a very simple agenda. In a moment, I'm going to talk to you about the objective of this particular session. There was a survey that I conducted as part of building this session. I'll take you into that a little bit, and then we'll go into a task mode introduction, and then we'll have a review at the end, predominantly regarding manually schedule mode, including its intended use, a recommendation, whether we consider this flexible or inflexible, and some additional insight and final thoughts. And then if I've timed this right today, we should have some time for closure and some questions and answers. But again, feel free to reach out to me anytime afterwards. Okay? So now we'll slow down a little bit and begin going through all these slides, and I have a lot of them. With a lot of screenshots, and we'll begin with this session objective. Okay. Our primary purpose today is to really gain a greater understanding of task mode, in particular as it relates to that great big feature add in Project 2010 called manually schedule. Okay. Auto schedule being the native scheduling mode, it's been with project since day one. But our objective today is to really think hard about this big feature add, manually schedule mode. I conducted a survey, and I thought a pretty decent survey prior to actually building out this presentation. I wanted to go out in the field and ask people what they thought of manually scheduled mode after it had been around for over a year or so. So I asked this question first. Why do you like manually scheduled mode? And somebody responded, nothing else changes. Somebody else said to get project to calculate a duration value without a constraint. Someone said, I like that I can plan some parts, for example, finish date and duration, and it, that being project, calculates the rest. Another person said the ability to stub out a project, specifically being able to say, this will happen in Q3 of 2014. Another person said flexibility in planning. That's what I like. Flexibility when task work and or dates are unknown. And then somebody said, I like the ease of use and Excel-like behavior, including text placeholder data. All right. So then I asked, why do you not like manually scheduled mode? And here was a long one. Someone said, I want to take advantage of the scheduling tool functionality offered to me via MS Project. If I merely wanted to enter rows of information, I would use Excel. I do not like that it does not have an option to hold work constant as you move dates. Now that was pretty insightful from the person that submitted that answer. Okay. We weren't that far into the future with manually scheduled mode, and I really liked that one. We'll talk about that a little later. Now, back in the day, somebody said, I don't like the issues we've encountered with manually scheduled tasks and PWA timesheets. Most of that has been resolved now. But back in the day, when manually scheduled mode first came out, that was a real common complaint. Okay. Then I asked, do you think people use manually scheduled mode because they don't understand or possibly fear auto schedule? And here's a good one. Sometimes, and it is a more spreadsheet-like entry point for those with low maturity or skills. But it is used for other reasons primarily. If I had to guess, I would say 35% out of fear related to auto schedule. That was really interesting to me when I read it. For someone to say, well, I think people, are using manually scheduled mode because they just don't understand project. Okay. Another person made their answer much briefer. All they said was yes. The next one said, I don't think fear is the issue. Manual scheduling is quick and easy, and my impression is that that's why they use it. Auto schedule mode requires additional learning, and many don't want to take the time to learn. Another very interesting response. Okay, we'll elaborate on that at the end of the seminar, because I'm going to come back to all of these and put my 2 cents worth on each of these. And then someone said yes, and I also think they lack the stomach to train on proper scheduling. I laughed when I saw that. I thought that was a pretty bold comment. Okay. And then finally somebody said, some do. However, a lot of people I work with use it as a planning tool, then switch it to auto schedule mode for execution. That's pretty good. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So at the end of the seminar, I'll come back to the survey again, and I'll throw my commentary in to each of the comments I received from people throughout the survey. So moving right along. Let's begin with an introduction to task mode. Task mode gives you the option of deciding how much control you want over task scheduling in a project. And as you know, or maybe you don't, it consists of manually schedule and auto schedule. Once again, manually schedule was introduced in Project 2010. Auto schedule is Microsoft Project's native scheduling mode. It's been around since day one. So let's talk about auto schedule briefly for a moment. For a new task, when you enter that new task, Project automatically calculates and displays values in the task duration, start, and finished fields. Changes to the schedule are automatically calculated based on dependencies, constraints, calendars, and other factors. Now, before I move on to manually schedule, one of the concerns that's been presented to me over the years is that as soon as you enter in a task in auto schedule mode and Project displays dates, if other people see those, even though these might not be the correct dates, if other people see them, they might think those are the dates. Okay? So I've heard that many times over the years with Project. But in auto schedule mode, you enter in that task, Project automatically calculates and displays values in task duration, start, and finish fields. Manually schedule, brought in Project 2010. For a new task, Project does not display values in the task duration, start, and finish fields. The key word here is display. Okay? Many people have said early on in the history of manually scheduled mode, look, when you key something in, nothing else happens. Well, let's keep thinking about that. The key word here truly is display. If you have a keen eye and you're looking at Project right here on my screen, and you see change highlighting has been working. Okay? And change highlighting activates on cells where changes have taken place. So again, the true keyword here is display. There's an assumption or two with manually scheduled mode. Okay? First of all, there is no schedule and shouldn't be until the user manually enters values in the task start and finish fields or changes task mode to auto schedule. Okay. Well, here's some facts about manually schedule. There is a schedule. It's simply not displayed. Auto schedule is calculating as indicated by change highlighting. Okay. Based on default settings, the scheduled duration, scheduled start, and scheduled finish fields display what will be displayed in the duration, start, and finish fields if task mode is changed to auto schedule. So if you look at my screenshot, when they added manually scheduled mode, there's 3 new fields in Project that came in 2010. Scheduled duration, scheduled start, and scheduled finish. which allowed the engineers at Microsoft in manually scheduled mode to not display values in duration, start, and finish. The question mark in the task mode field flags the manually scheduled task as a placeholder. Okay, so if I go back here and you take a look at the task mode field and you see the push pin there that represents a manually scheduled task and the little question mark there, that question mark designates that manually scheduled task as a placeholder. So what I did for this presentation is I went out to the dictionary and looked up the word placeholder, and I thought I would take a definition right out of the dictionary. Something used or included temporarily or as a substitute for something that is not known or must remain generic, that which holds, denotes, or reserves a place for something to come. Well, when there's no values in duration, start, and finish, that makes perfect sense. It's just a placeholder. If default values aren't in duration, start, and finish, they're a placeholder. Okay? Waiting and reserving a place for the true values to come. The placeholder designation remains until the task duration, start, and finish fields contain standard duration, start, and finish values. See, in manually scheduled mode, you could go to any one of those three fields, and if you had a question about any of those three fields, you could type in something like Ask Bob. That would not be a default value in any of those fields. It would just be text that says, hey, Dan, you're really not quite sure what duration is. You should probably go talk with Bob. But once standard duration, start, and finish fields contain those standard, once those three fields contain those standard values, the question mark would disappear, meaning the task is no longer a placeholder, but it's still manually scheduled. Okay. So I eventually got to a point when I was studying manually schedule and I put in 300 hours of prep time for that initial presentation. I heard at a global Microsoft project conference for 2010 what the marketing people said was the intended use of manually scheduled mode, but I didn't believe it. So we went back to our contacts at Microsoft on the engineering team and we said, hey, here's what we heard at the conference. Can you tell us why you really put this great big feature ad in Project 2010? And there was the answer. This was the intended use. It continues today, but there's so much functionality added, and we don't have time to cover it all today. It's very easy to begin thinking about and using manually scheduled mode for many other things other than what it was truly designed for. We went to the lead engineer that we've known on the Microsoft project team since the 1980s and asked him point blank, why? Why did you put this in? And there was the answer. And this was to help compete with other products that allowed top-down summary task planning. In auto-schedule mode, Microsoft project has always been bottom-up. You put information in on your subtask, it rolls up and is automatically summarized at the summary task. Prior to Project 2010, Microsoft project never had the ability to do top-down summary task planning. Now, keep this in mind. At the Global Microsoft Project 2010 conference, what the marketing people told us that were in attendance is they said user-controlled scheduling. That's what they called manually scheduled mode. User-controlled scheduled. Now you are in control. You key things in and nothing else changes. Finally, you have control over project. Okay, that was very misleading, but it's easy to understand why somebody could say that. We'll elaborate on that a little bit as we go along. But if you're taking notes and you've always wondered why was this feature added, that's it right there. And then we were told, let's expand upon that a little bit. It's really designed to support early planning efforts in situations where task duration, task start, and or task finish are unknown. All right? but maybe you have some historical information about phases overall, about what they consume, regardless of what the exact details are for the subtask. So there it is, right there. So now what we'll do is we'll go into a little more detail. We'll keep building on this. Okay? Let's take a look at a manually scheduled task. Again, for a new task, as previously described, Microsoft Project does not display values in the task, duration, start, and finish fields. Okay? Remember this. The keyword is display. Take a look at change highlighting. If somebody stood on the stage and said, look, finally, you key something in and nothing else changes, that's not true. There's changes taking place here. You can clearly see it through change highlighting. You just can't see it. Okay? Now, by not displaying these values, part of the intent is achieved. A reviewer of the schedule infers that not much is known about this schedule at this time. Therefore, the task must be in its early planning stages. So again, this is a strong point of manually scheduled mode. If I take you back one slide here, and if you type in task A, and you save your schedule, and you walk away from your computer, and somebody walks by and they look at your computer screen, and they see task A there, but they don't see duration, they don't see start, and they don't see finish, they're not going to immediately be inclined to think, those are the dates. So there's part of the value of manually scheduled mode, not displaying information by default, at least as I've entered task A. Okay, and I would say, yep, that's a strong point of manually scheduled mode. I'm not doing top-down planning in that example, but I'll give it this one. Okay, what about a summary task? Now we're talking more about top-down planning. In the early stages of a project phase, task details may be unknown, even though reasonable duration, start, and or finish estimates exist for the phase itself. I mentioned that earlier. So to support this knowledge, values may be manually entered in the task duration, start, and finish fields at the summary task level, and these values will not change based on subtask entries as long as that summary task stays in manually scheduled mode. That is top-down planning. Okay, so again, maybe we open a template and we collapse it to outline level 1 where our phases are. And we just begin scratching in some high-level information at the phase level because we're a long ways away from working the subtask that ultimately we want to roll up to that phase level. That is top-down planning. So take a look. There's a straight work breakdown structure with 5 activities typed in, phase 1 through phase 1 complete. I've selected task A through phase 1 complete. My intent is to promote task ID 1 to a manually scheduled pure placeholder, meaning no values in the task duration, start, and finish fields, summary task by demoting, indenting that is, task 2 through 5. Now, there are certain characteristics of maneuvers that you take regarding manually scheduled mode that I don't quite agree with, but you just have to learn how things take place depending upon the actions that you take in project. So right now I have task A, B, C, and phase 1 complete selected, and I want to indent them. I want to demote them. So when I do that, okay, I now have my summary task, but based on the way I went about it, it automatically took phase 1 and changed it to auto scheduled. I'm not sure to this day if that's a design flaw. Okay. If they intended to do that, thinking while you're down working on the subtask now, you've indented these tasks, you must want all of this information to roll up to the summary task. I'm not 100% sure on that one. but it turned it automatically into an auto-scheduled task, and as soon as that happens, you get your default duration, start and finish values like you have since day one with project. All right, so expecting a manually scheduled pure placeholder summary task, I didn't get that. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I didn't get that. So now to create the manually scheduled pure placeholder summary task, all values in the task duration, start and finish fields must be cleared. And once cleared, the summary task is now a manually scheduled pure placeholder summary task. I used the word advanced today in front of the title of this seminar. I didn't go change this back here in the task mode field from auto scheduled to manually scheduled. All I did was clear these values. It's interesting to me that when a task is sitting as an auto scheduled task, that you can actually delete those values, and by doing that, have project automatically turn that task into a manually scheduled summary task. But it did. So now I have a pure placeholder. I know I'm in manually scheduled mode because of the push pin. I know I'm in manually scheduled mode because I don't see default values. And I know it's a pure placeholder because the question mark is here, and that question mark has nothing to do with the question mark in the duration field. This just designates this activity as a placeholder, waiting for default duration, start, and finish values to appear. Okay. So I had a question I had to ask back then. Can you think of an issue that may arise as a result of allowing edits to the task duration, start, and finish fields for an auto-scheduled summary task? I would think you would have to change it to a manually scheduled task before you could make edits, not take other actions that would automatically change it. So later in our webinar here today, I'll show you one that's tripped many people up where they've sent me notes going, Dan, I don't understand. How come my summary tasks are suddenly turning into manually scheduled tasks? And then finally, based on the initial intent of this example, now I'm ready for top-down planning. Unless, of course, I had a template all set up and ready to go, which would make it easier, but I just wanted to show you these steps. So there's the intent right there of this feature ad. I have no idea what duration, start, and finish might be for task A, B, and C. No clue. Phase 1 complete, I could set duration to 0 days and turn that into a milestone because that's what it's ultimately going to be. But here we are very early on. We may or may not take on this project. We have no idea what task A, B, and C might entail, but we go to somebody who's familiar with these type of projects and do a little benchmarking, and they say the same thing. Well, I can't give you, real details for each of the tasks, but historically, a phase like this in this project, okay, has taken about 5 days. So you can enter that in. And then, like the marketing people said, nothing else changes. I don't believe that. All I have to do is look at the Gantt bar out here in the Gantt chart. Something else did change. It's just not displayed. So this is the intent of manually scheduled mode here, top-down planning. And part of the beauty is keeping things from being displayed so people don't instantly believe that those are the dates. Okay, so some assumptions about manually scheduled mode again. There is no schedule and shouldn't be until the user manually enters values in the task start and finish fields or changes task mode to auto schedule. If there's no schedule, there shouldn't be a Gantt bar. Okay. Manually scheduled facts. There is a schedule and there is a Gantt bar. Auto schedule is calculating. It's simply not displayed in the task sheet. The Gantt chart clearly shows this. Okay. If you take a look at this screenshot on the bottom of this slide, If you double-click a background area of a Gantt chart, you'll go into the bar styles dialog box. This is the bar style that is set up for a duration-only, active, manually scheduled placeholder. And look at the fields that it represents out in the Gantt chart: task start and task finish. So again, nothing's displayed here, but project is indeed calculating a schedule. In a project server environment, if there's any doubt as to whether or not task start and task finish exist, simply review the SQL table. I had an engineer on our team who's very skilled with SQL a few years ago go back and pull this information out of the SQL table. And all you have to do is look here for task A. There's definitely a start date and definitely a finish date for that task in that project. By not displaying summary task start and finish, again, the intent early planning efforts has been achieved. So it's very easy to look at that screenshot, that little project schedule, and say, all right, early planning efforts. Somebody's estimating 5 days of duration for the phase. We have no idea when it might happen. I'm not going to pay attention to the Gantt bar. I'm focusing in on start and finish for row 1. And for task A, B, and C, we don't have any detailed information yet. So far, so good. Okay. Now, imagine keying in duration values for task A, B, and C. Now we're a little farther along. We're out talking to people that know about task A, B, and C, and we get some estimates of 3 days, 6 days, and 5 days, and we key those in manually scheduled mode. Well, notice that it did not impact what we have at phase 1, the 5 days of duration that we were given for the phase earlier on in the planning cycle. Again, nothing else at this point is displayed based on the actions that I've taken. But if you look at the Gantt chart, there's a duration-only bar for task A, B, and C. There is one for phase 1 complete, and there's a manually scheduled roll-up summary, okay, which is extending the schedule all the way out to the 14th of February. So even though nothing is displayed here, look at row 0, which is always in auto-scheduled mode. Project is doing its job. It is indeed calculating a schedule. Manually scheduled mode is just giving me the ability visually to piece this together at a high level and then at a detailed level without changing the high level, allowing me to do an easy comparison. Here's what we thought 5 days much earlier on, and today we have a task that we're estimating 6 days. That would be in conflict with our earlier phase level estimate of 5 days. Apparently some more information has come to light that we just couldn't have known when we estimated the phase. So once again, please remember there is a schedule. Auto schedule is calculating. It's simply not displayed in the task sheet. So now we'll go a little bit further and get a little bit more advanced. If an edit is made to task start, end, or finish for the manually scheduled summary task, manually scheduled subtask with no manually entered task start, end, or finish dates will be rescheduled without display. Specific auto-scheduled task will also be rescheduled. Now, why did I write that note? I always go back to what I heard right out of the starting blocks at the Global 2010 conference. Look, when you key in something, nothing else changes. I'll never forget that. A couple thousand people in the audience started cheering, saying, yay, finally, I know what project is always doing. I put something else in and nothing else changes. That was not good. Okay? That was not a good marketing message. There are many actions you can take in manually scheduled mode, and there's always something either taking place under the hood or visually in front of you. So, at a high level, we have a recommendation. Use manually scheduled mode strictly for early planning efforts, which includes top-down planning. That is our recommendation right there. If you said to me, Dan, when would you use manually scheduled mode? That would be it. For top-down planning as it was designed, way back in those early planning efforts where you may or may not take something on. At least with manually scheduled mode, you can build a Microsoft project schedule into your system that when people see it, they're not instantly going to think, those are the dates. And you can do your top-down planning in your early planning efforts. The phase level planning is good. And then as schedule information becomes more concrete, and it looks like you're going to take this project on, I would always recommend changing task mode to auto schedule, because to me that's where the true horsepower and flexibility in project lives. If, however, your early planning efforts require subtask resource work estimates, at minimum, change task mode to auto schedule for subtask. You could leave manually scheduled mode on at your summary task level, but now if you're getting past manually scheduled duration, start, and or finish estimates, now you're talking about building a team. Now you're talking about assigning people. So you're in assignment planning, step 3 of planning. And now you're talking about work estimates. You must be, I would believe, at a point where you know a whole lot more about this project and the odds are much higher that you're going to take it on. So get away from manually scheduled mode and go to where the true horsepower and flexibility of project lives. Here's some observations. Manually scheduled tends to be an issue in situations where scheduling includes more than task duration and dates, as we just described. When detailed work estimates are required and estimates automatically change, frustration mounts. I'll elaborate on that soon. When effort-driven does not activate and work changes, frustration mounts. When resource allocation stockpiles during execution, again, frustration mounts. These are all symptoms, traits, whatever you want to call them, of manually scheduled mode. In situations where I would say you're far beyond it, you should be in auto-scheduled mode. Okay? And the list goes on. So based on these observations, I put some thoughts together. Again, when manually scheduled mode was introduced, many people affectionately referred to this mode as user-controlled scheduling. Suddenly, or so it seemed, this new mode of scheduling put you, the user, in complete control of the schedule. One could argue that what user-controlled scheduling really means is the user is in control of the applied scheduling mode, and that's all. In other words, you can tell project whether you want it to be auto-scheduled or manually scheduled. That, to me, is what user-controlled is. But back in the beginning, manually scheduled mode was introduced as now you, the user, are in complete control. And I'm hoping to dispel that here shortly. All right, take a breath. Moving right along. When you think about manually scheduled mode, some people called it flexible, a very flexible way to schedule. Well, the question I would ask then is manually scheduled truly flexible or inflexible? If manually scheduled mode is thought to put you, the user, in control, well, then it must be flexible. It must provide the flexibility needed to work project without worry about what project may or may not be doing. A fear that many people have with auto schedule. Before we move on, we believe here at Milestone that auto schedule provides greater control and flexibility over scheduling than manually schedule. And if you ask me, I would say by a long shot. One way to begin looking at this is by understanding what manually scheduled mode takes away and what it's made of. Then we will look at other issues related to using manually scheduled mode beyond our stated recommendation of early planning efforts, including top-down planning. So let's start with project scheduling engine, the heart and soul of the product. In manually scheduled mode, the user no longer has control over primary components of project scheduling engine, including task type, effort-driven, and constraint type and constraint date. For the most part, you no longer have control over all of that. Okay? Let's think about task type for a minute in the scheduling engine. Manually scheduled mode forces fixed duration scheduling. The ability to operate the scheduling engine in a fixed units or fixed work mode is removed. So take a look at this screenshot. Task A is currently auto-scheduled with the task type set to fixed units. Okay? Once task mode is changed to manually schedule, the ability to edit task type is removed. So you can see this is now grayed out. If the schedule needs to be shortened by 2 days, with work remaining at 20 hours, any change in duration will result in a change in work. Okay? So I went ahead and crashed the schedule. I even changed the task type to fixed work, crashed the schedule by 2 days, and project still changed work from 20 to 12. Okay? And again, as I just said, even if fixed work has been applied prior to the task becoming manually scheduled, work will change. So as soon as you flag a task as manually scheduled, that task is locked down as a fixed duration task. And there's nothing you can do about it. In auto-scheduled mode, on a fixed units task, any change in duration results in a change in work, and on a fixed work task, any change in duration results in a recalculation of peak. In manually scheduled mode, any change in duration forces a change in work regardless of the task type set during auto-scheduled mode. This is proof that manually scheduled mode forces fixed duration scheduling, a scheduling mode that in today's world of project management and Microsoft project is not nearly as relevant as it was, say, 20 to 25 years ago. So I was initially told user-controlled scheduling. It's flexible. You are in control. And now as I'm getting deeper into this, I'm getting the sense that no, I'm not. I'm losing the ability to change how Microsoft project behaves, and I'm being forced into a mode of scheduling. That doesn't sound user-controlled to me. Okay. What about effort-driven? Manually scheduled mode does not allow automatic effort-driven scheduling. The ability to use effort-driven for distributing remaining work is removed. And like task type, the impact of this is on work. Here's another example. Task A is currently auto-scheduled with effort-driven selected. Once task mode is changed to manually schedule, the ability to edit effort-driven is removed. If the schedule needs to be shortened, with work continuing to be 20 hours across all assigned resources, when an additional resource is added without specifying a work value, effort-driven does not activate, duration does not change, and work increases. Now I have 40 hours of work between the two. So you get to a point where you say, why? Why do you suppose manually scheduled mode is designed this way? And you go back in time and you think about one of the #1 complaints that people have had with project over the years. I don't understand why project is always changing my dates. Well, there is no feature in Microsoft Project called fixed dates, so there's no way to permanently fix dates. But the best you can do to control duration and dates in Microsoft Project is to use the fixed duration task type. That doesn't guarantee that your duration and your dates are going to remain fixed until one day you change them, because there is no way to permanently fix dates in project. But the engineers at Microsoft realized the best way within the tool as it was designed to control changes in dates is with fixed duration. So if you don't remember anything else from our time together today, what I want you to always remember, when you flip the switch from auto-scheduled mode to manually scheduled mode, you have now bought in to fixed duration scheduling, which also applies during execution when you're tracking. Okay? The increase in work in the effort-driven situation leads to frustration, just as it does in the task type example. For maintaining work estimates, manually scheduled mode is not so flexible. What about constraint type and constraint date? Okay. In manually scheduled mode, in a project scheduled from a start date, when a date is entered, scheduling operates in a start no earlier than constraint mode. So really put your thinking hats on now as it relates to constraints. Okay? The ability to operate the scheduling engine using other constraints is basically removed, except for the default constraint as soon as possible. One of the enticing attributes of manually scheduled mode is the belief that you can enter a date and project will not add a constraint like it does in auto-scheduled mode. Now, first of all, we highly recommend that you never touch task start and finish in auto-scheduled mode. That's the tool's job at all times. Okay? But when it comes to manually scheduled mode, I've heard people say, oh, this is great. I can enter a start date and project will not add a constraint. Well, if the project start date is Monday and the start date of Thursday is manually entered, how do you suppose project holds that date? Through a start no earlier than constraint. You just can't see the constraint indicator here in the indicators column. This behavior is exactly the same as in auto-scheduled mode, absent the proper listing in the constraint type and constraint date fields and display of the constraint indicator. In this example, if auto-schedule is now applied, by default, the manually entered date will be lost. In this situation, project is designed to reset the date based on the default as soon as possible constraint. All right, kind of deep, but that's what happens. Now, you might say, well, if I'm going to change the schedule back to auto schedule, I want project to maintain that date I manually entered in manually scheduled mode. Well, if you want project to hold that manually entered date, that is, keep the start no earlier than constraint, then you need to go File, Backstage to Options, and go to the Schedule page, and you need to scroll down to the Scheduling Options for this project section and select an option that got added in Project 2010 called Keep Task on Nearest Working Day when changing to automatically scheduled mode. And that will set that task on the nearest working day, which could be the day you selected. And how will it hold it there? Start no earlier than. The constraint that's applied based on the steps I've taken so far that you can't see through the indicators column while in manually scheduled mode. Stop and think about everything we've talked about so far. Kind of clever, right? Let's just not display things. Because by displaying things, we tend to worry people. This option, keep task on nearest working day when changing to automatically scheduled mode, simply means keep the start no earlier than constraint applied when switching to auto schedule mode. So there in this screenshot I did that. I switched to auto schedule mode. This option here, keep task on nearest working day when changing to automatically scheduled mode, okay, is now visible. And the date that I manually entered in the start field in manually scheduled mode is now being held by the constraint that you could not see while in manually scheduled mode. When a new manually scheduled task is entered, again, the task duration, start and finish fields simply do not display. Why? To support early planning efforts. With constraints, it is somewhat the same, as constraint type and constraint date are not accessible and the constraint indicator is not displayed. Think about it. When you manually enter a start date in either mode, it sticks. By operating in manually scheduled mode, for the most part, access to all other constraint types is taken away. Not very flexible, one might say. One more example regarding constraints. Here I am in auto schedule mode and I put a must start on constraint of 2/5/14. Task A has now been changed to manually scheduled. Well, do you notice it's still sitting on 2/5/14, but you can't see the constraint indicator now. It's just not displayed while in manually scheduled mode. The question that needs to be answered, what's holding the task on 2/5/14, assuming manually scheduled mode does not use constraints? Well, we know what's holding it there. If the manually scheduled task is changed back to be auto-scheduled without any change in dates, while manually scheduled, project reestablishes the must start on constraint. If, however, a change is made to the start or finish date while manually scheduled, project will apply and hold a start no earlier than constraint when switching to auto-scheduled based on the fact that a constraint other than as soon as possible was previously applied. Okay? Now that's really interesting. I start off with a must start on constraint in auto-scheduled mode. And then I change to manually scheduled mode. In manually scheduled mode, I can't see the constraint indicator, but I know it's there. I can't see it, but I know it's there. And then while in manually scheduled mode, I change the start date to another date. And then I go back to auto-scheduled mode. But this time, as soon as possible doesn't reestablish itself. Project plants a start no earlier than constraint on it, based on the fact that there was a constraint other than as soon as possible previously applied. It took a little bit years ago to figure all this stuff out, but you can see there's so much to this concept of manually scheduled mode if you get away from top-down planning at the summary task level. In the end, whether you're using manually scheduled or auto-scheduled mode, when entering dates, you are performing the exact same thing, constraint-based scheduling. Each mode simply differs slightly in display and removal, but nothing too different. Okay? Manually scheduled mode disguises the constraint by not displaying it. That's the major difference. Auto-scheduled mode provides many more constraint-type options than manually scheduled mode. Therefore, I would say it's more flexible. So moving along, what about when you get into execution? and you want to understand how manually scheduled mode operates with task type and assignment time phase tracking. Well, by now you know that if your task is in manually scheduled mode, you are operating in a fixed duration mode, whether you want to be or not. We discussed this fact earlier. As soon as you move to manually scheduled mode, fixed duration scheduling is enabled and can't be changed. This is significant during execution as it relates to what we call assignment time phased, or you could call it timesheet tracking. Take a look at that screenshot. There's Bradley Beck, assigned 50%, 20 hours of work to the auto-scheduled fixed units task. Okay? If he puts in 2 hours on that first day, you know that Microsoft Project is designed for project work. The 2 he didn't do gets moved out to the next day. That's been frustrating to people over the years. I key in something and now my dates change. Well, I understand why. There was 4 scheduled, only 2 got done. Project's not going to get rid of the 2 he didn't do. It moves it out in time. But that's been a complaint to people because they didn't understand that. Okay? So think about the same example from a manually scheduled perspective. There's the same setup. Bradley Beck, 50%, 20 hours of work. He comes in and he does 2 hours on that first day. Well, project's not going to get rid of the 2 he didn't do. It took the 2 and it distributed evenly across the remaining across the remaining fixed duration days. Even though I initially had this in auto-scheduled mode as a fixed units task, the second you go to manually scheduled, you are operating in a fixed duration mode and you can't change it. So the 2 we didn't do got layered over the remaining days. And why would this make somebody happy that doesn't understand project in auto-scheduled mode? Is their finish date didn't change. But not understanding how dates operate in project and auto-scheduled mode is not reason to move to manually scheduled mode. It's not reason for someone to stand on stage and say, look, now you're in complete control. You enter in something and nothing else changes. Well, something did change. The requirement on the resource just went up right here every single day of the last 4 days. So you can never believe it when somebody says, look, you key in something and nothing else changes. That's not accurate. Okay? Why do you suppose manually scheduled mode is designed this way? Well, it's fixed duration. The real reason behind that is it's the only way to control, not the only way, but the primary way in project to control dates the best you can, knowing there's no way to permanently fix them. And finally, for organizations using task total and/or assignment total methods of tracking in conjunction with projects completed and remaining parts calculation options, you can't use manually schedule as the calculation options do not work with fixed duration scheduling, which is exactly what manually scheduled mode is. So all 4 of those options for 2 of the 4 possibilities for updating a Microsoft Project schedule and straight Microsoft Project Desktop are gone. Can't use them. Coming down the home stretch. I know I can't hear everybody talking right now, but maybe later you can put in the chat window, looking at this old horse race here, maybe somebody can send Bob a chat and tell him who that horse is, number 2. A very famous racehorse. Here's some additional insight for you. As we come down the home stretch, manually schedule, auto change to manually schedule. Be careful. Dragging values such as duration through auto-scheduled summary task automatically changes task mode to manually schedule. And I told you earlier, I've had people contact me over the years and say, Dan, I don't understand why my summary tasks are automatically changing to manually scheduled mode. I promise you I didn't do it. Well, maybe they put in 5 days of duration on task A, and then they grabbed the fill handle and they dragged it down and dropped it, hoping it would only land on these subtasks. Well, it landed on these summary tasks and it automatically turned them to manually schedule. Okay? Be careful. Your project could appear estimated at row 0 when all tasks are not. Estimated duration. Take a look at the 5 task rows I have in that plan. The question mark is cleared from all 5, but it's still sitting at row 0. That could happen. So now the reader thinks there's something about your schedule you haven't got sign-off on yet. Could be. Be careful. Manually scheduled tasks can end up scheduled during non-working periods. If you look at this manually scheduled duration-only Gantt bar, that's sitting there scheduled on Saturday, and I actually have somebody assigned to task A, and they have work scheduled on Saturday, and their calendar says they're not available, and I promise you I don't have a task calendar instructed to override resource calendars on it. So you have to be careful. Be careful, manually scheduled tasks can have trouble with task calendars. I applied a task calendar to task A where the only working days are Wednesday and Thursday. Okay? Well, the Gantt bar should be on Wednesday and Thursday, not back on Monday and Tuesday. Be careful, it is very easy for text values to be replaced by default values. Up here, working in manually scheduled mode, going about it by remembering you key in something and nothing else changes. Well, I keyed in 5 days and nothing else happened. At least that's what I thought, but something really did under the hood. And then I wasn't sure about a start date, so I wrote myself a note here, ask Dave, because you can write text into these fields in manually scheduled mode. But as soon as I typed in ask Dave, project filled in. Okay, I'm sorry, as soon as I actually put a date there, if Dave said 2414, then project put in the 3rd value. So in manually scheduled mode, whenever you have 2 of the default values you normally find in either of these 3 fields, project is going to fill in the 3rd. Okay? Based on certain actions you take. Be careful, it is very easy to lose a manually entered value such as duration. I had a duration value there. I didn't like the date was there, so I cleared it out of that cell. Well, it took duration with it. Caution, clearing duration does not clear assignment duration. I cleared duration at the task level of the data model here for task A, but even though duration is not a field you can see at the assignment level, it's still there. 5 days of duration are still there. The schedule is still running from 2.3 to 2.7. Just because I cleared that value doesn't mean it also clears at the assignment level, just at the task level. Caution, a placeholder does not count towards overallocation, even though the overallocation truly exists. So here's Bradley Beck. Bradley Beck is assigned to task A and task B, 16 hours each day. His calendar says he has 8 available. No resource overallocation indicators. Not while this task is in a placeholder mode. Okay. Take notice, published assignments to project server include dates even if none are displayed in the schedule. Caution, manually scheduled tasks are given priority when the standard or priority standard leveling orders are invoked. So you have to understand how manually scheduled mode fits in resource leveling if you're calling upon projects leveling algorithms. Caution, messaging you've grown accustomed to does not display for manually scheduled tasks, which is really interesting to me. I'm used to seeing the planning wizard in certain situations. I'm used to seeing Microsoft project scheduling messages in certain situations. But while in manually scheduled mode, messaging's not uniform. Caution, your organization might not allow manually scheduled tasks to be published to my work pages in PWA. So there's many things. We could go on and talk a lot more about this and go through a lot of examples and study Gantt bars. There's many things. But we're running a little short on time. We're getting closer to the end, and I want to take you back to that survey. Again, the question I asked was, why do you like manually scheduled mode? And the first person responded, nothing else changes. Not true. The second person said, to get project to calculate the duration value without a constraint. The schedule is constrained. I like that I can plan some parts, for example, finish date and duration, and it calculates the rest. Auto schedule mode does so as well, although we do not recommend doing the tool's job. Why do you like manually scheduled mode continued? The ability to stub out a project, specifically being able to say X will happen in Q3 2014. Manually schedule is good for this. Early planning efforts, top-down planning. Somebody said flexibility in planning. Flexibility when task work and or dates are unknown. Okay? For early planning efforts where dates are unknown, manually schedule adds value. When task work is unknown, manually scheduled really does not provide any value. Okay? I like the ease of use and Excel-like behavior, including text placeholder data. Manually scheduled is good for text placeholder data, like in the cell where I wrote, Ask Dave. Then I asked, why do you not like manually scheduled mode? Well, again, someone said, I want to take advantage of the scheduling tool functionality offered to me via project. If I merely wanted to enter rows of information, I would use Excel. I have no comment. I do not like that it does not have an option to hold work constant as you move dates. Manually scheduled mode is fixed duration, constraint-based scheduling. Never forget that. I don't like the issues we've encountered with manually scheduled tasks and PWA timesheets. At that time, it was understood. My sources tell me most all of that has been resolved. Do you think people use manually scheduled mode because they don't understand or possibly fear auto-schedule? Remember the person that said, well, I would guess that 35% of the people use manually schedule because of their fear? I have no comment on that. All I can say is there's nothing to fear about project in auto-scheduled mode. In auto-schedule mode, you have full flexibility and complete control of all features and functions, unlike manually scheduled mode. To the person that said yes, I have no comment. Okay. And then one person said, I don't think fear is the issue. Manually scheduled is quick and easy, and my impression is that that's why they use it. Auto-scheduled mode requires additional learning, and many don't want to take the time to learn. We disagree completely with the part about auto-schedule requiring additional learning. As a matter of fact, we think manually scheduled takes way more learning. And based on our studies, it's not as quick and easy as one would think. It's a major feature add with all kinds of twists and turns. And somebody said yes, and also they lack the stomach to train on proper scheduling. Well, I agree, but manually schedule itself does not by default mean you are a proper scheduler. Somebody said some do. However, a lot of people I work with use it as a planning tool, then switch it to auto-scheduled mode for execution. Our only concern here is during planning. Once resources and work are involved, you're much farther along. Switch to auto-scheduled mode and take advantage of the full horsepower of project. And I like the part about switching during execution. To me, there's no reason to be in manually scheduled mode in execution. It wasn't designed for that. It was designed for planning. We were told that by the people that built this, not by the marketing people that tried to sell it. And then I asked a globally renowned expert way back in the day, before this presentation was delivered at that conference, and I asked him, do your customers up and down the northeast seaboard of the United States of America use manually scheduled mode? And he said, no, I don't really use it that much. Let's talk about this out in California. So my final thoughts. Manually scheduled mode is really good at what it was built for, top-down planning in the context of early planning efforts. YJTJ still applies. In manually scheduled mode, project is doing its job, and that is managing schedule. Please don't use manually scheduled mode based on fear of auto schedule. Understand auto schedule mode, then make a decision. Manually scheduled mode becomes an issue when believed to be flexible when used for more than our stated recommendation. If you like the idea of fixed dates, let's chat. Right? If your organization is saying, dang, I really wish there was a way in project to permanently fix dates, well, maybe there's a software development initiative that could be taken to maybe try and do that. So the initial question that this presentation truly led off with, manually scheduled versus auto-scheduled, how hard can it be? Problematic if you go beyond the initial intent of manually schedule mode. So that sums it up. Again, our recommendation, top-down planning. During your early planning efforts, where details of a schedule are unknown, but there might be some historical data for phases that you could start with. That is what it was designed for. Okay. In closure, we'd like to make sure you always understand that we have a number of hands-on courses. Bob Tyler, who's manning the controls today, is a great guy to talk to about our 3-day hands-on course, our resource manager course, our accidental project manager course, our project server administrative courses. And then we've taken just the desktop tool and broke it into a 4-part series. I'd be happy to talk with you at any time about parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 and what they entail and the value that they provide. And you can get information off our website as well. Some of you already know that recently we've been putting some just good nuggets of information about project and project server out in something we call milestone minutes. Okay, if you go out to our website, you can certainly go out and take a look at any of these posts that we have. And then you can certainly talk to myself or Bob about any upcoming classes. If you're interested about those, you can register through those through Eventbrite. And at that point, I would say we've crossed the finish line. Here's the PDU information for today. I'll give you a moment to write that down. It's worth 1 PDU, 0.75 technical, 0.25 strategic. Again, Bob Tyler, he's our PMI guy that handles our PMI relations. If you have any questions about PDUs for any of our offerings, you can certainly ask me, but I would encourage you to direct those questions to Bob. So I'll leave that there for another moment. If you don't get this information, send me a note. We'll put this back up at the end. Right now, what I'd like to do is open this up for questions. So I'm going to leave it to Bob now. If there's any questions, to relay those to me. And then I'll either just try to answer those or I'll bring project up and try and show you some things in project.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was a good webinar. I do want to let everybody know that we have recorded this presentation and we will post it on Milestone's YouTube channel. If you go out to the Milestone website, click on the newsletter in the upper right corner, then there will be a link directly to our YouTube channel. This presentation should be up there within a couple days. Dan, so apparently that was so well done, nobody has any questions, or at least they're not typing them into the chat window. So let me ask all the participants, if you have any questions at all, by all means, enter them into the chat window. Dan is standing by.
It is a lot of information, that's for sure, and it does assume some background with project. That's also for sure. So if you ever have any questions about this, let me know. I saw a question come up there. When is your next webinar? What will the topic be? Do we have one, Bob?
Well, we have one tentatively scheduled for mid-July, but I'm thinking I may have to move it. Our next webinar is going to be on project PPM, Project Server, and how Project Server on-premise can manage agile projects. Very specific information. We'll be developing more of these webinars throughout the summer and into the fall. We will be emailing everybody. We'll be emailing everybody with that schedule. Everybody who signed up for the education list. Did have a couple questions. One person asked, when unknowns come up during execution without determined durations, wouldn't it be prudent to use manual mode at those times?
Well, you know, there's always the three words I use called matter of style. And during execution, I personally would be inclined to not use manually scheduled mode. I think I'd be more inclined, if you're looking at my screen still here, let's say all of these were in auto scheduled mode. If we were in execution, naturally I would hope that we would not have estimated, and that would be the question mark in the duration field. But if we had an unknown about a current duration value for a specific phase in execution, then my preference would be to flag it that way. Oops. To flag the task in there in that way that have some unknown flavor to them, to allow that question mark to roll to the summary task itself. So if there are certain tasks in a certain phase during execution where we're having trouble with estimating durations because of changes, then I would change the flag back to estimated. In other words, the flag field, the yes for estimated, so that would flag that entire phase that way. Now, could I have simply just changed task mode to manually scheduled and put it that way? And maybe even went as far as clearing all of the values. I could. Okay, I could certainly do that. So my preference would be in execution not to do what I just did, but you could, right? Matter of style. It's just when you get to that point where you have more concrete information about whatever these subtasks are, then you're going to want to revert back to auto-scheduled mode. So that would be that'd be a matter of style. If it worked well for you, you could certainly do that. I would avoid doing that at the subtask level, but I might be convinced to do that temporarily at the summary task level.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Got another question about with Agile project management. Do you find that people want to use manually scheduled mode more often?
Well, this functionality that got added to Microsoft Project is basically brand new for the Project Online world, and I don't have enough historical knowledge of Agile with Project or within Project to know yet what the user community is truly doing. Now, Bob is more of our resident Agile expert than I, but I can say right now there's not enough historical evidence in our customer community to allow me to answer that question.
Well, and let me kind of chime in, Dan. Yes, you certainly can use manually scheduled mode for Agile activities. it's a lot of work. And the few people I've seen who've tried to use it, they usually abandon that pretty quickly. Now, the way Microsoft has implemented task boards, as you see on the screen, I think it's a matter of time before the tool really does a good job with Agile. Right now, we use custom fields and other things to control the scheduling. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. You know, it was kind of like questions about manually scheduled mode 2 to 3 months after it first came out. It was really hard to answer a question like that until there was a little bit more time behind this. So hopefully, you know, I'll do a little research and see if I can come up with something, and then maybe we'll, you know, do a webinar of some kind related to, you know, Agile and different scheduling types and project. I did also see, Bob, there a question from Jessica, I think it was, when she said, when is your next webinar? What will the topic be? Jessica, if you're still there, you can certainly submit a topic and then say, hey, this is what I'd really like to learn more about, and let us think about it, and maybe we'll spin that one up.
Well, Dan, I think we are at the end, so thank you again very much. Good webinar. Thanks to everybody who attended. And as I mentioned, we will be posting the recording up on our YouTube channel.
Thanks again. Have a great day. Feel free to reach out.